What's going on, guys? Today we are going to talk about some books I've read that were just weird. Alrighty, the first book that came to mind for this one was Kind of a Big Deal. Like, that's the name of the book. The book wasn't a big deal, it wasn't a great book. Like, the title of the book was kind of a big deal. Okay, the title is on screen now. Kind of a Big Deal is the first book I have here. It was at first glance a contemporary novel about this girl, Josie, who has made it big with an acting career in her hometown, then failed once she tried to get on Broadway. Surprise, surprise. She ends up in an unfamiliar town to try and move past this, and that's where the book starts. Now, this book wasn't bad, up until the plot started. Then things got weird. I thought this would be just a normal contemporary novel about a girl trying to find her place in the world. But partway through, it segued into this fantasy where whenever she reads a book, she is transported into that story. Weird, right? First off, the way the author wrote the transitions between books was terrible. You have no idea what's going on, and it's so jarring that at every transition you are yanked out of the story. In addition, Josie as a character is extremely annoying, which I guess is intentional on the author's part, but there's a fine line between unlikable but understandable and just unlikable. This was all in the beginning and the middle of the book. The ending is where it really gets weird. The books that the main character keeps falling into were all given to her by this hot guy at the bookstore in the town she's living in. And at the end, this guy turns out to be one of the 9 Greek muses, and she ends up not being able to get out of one of the books she falls into and having to fight the 9 Greek muses for her freedom. Just so you know, there's no mention of anything to do with the muses until like halfway through the book, and even then it's just a brief comment about how you are supposed to thank the muses before every show. It is really hard to follow and overall weird. I highly doubt the author plotted this before they started writing, and that always creates some weird storylines. Next up, we have Playlist for the Dead. This one was similar to Kind of a Big Deal in that it segued into a fantasy partway through, but what really set it apart was how it seemed like the author regretted turning it into a fantasy and scrambled to clean up the fantasy elements right at the end of the book. It follows Sam, whose best friend Hayden commits suicide, and leaves him with a note and a playlist telling him it will explain everything. Not a bad setup if you're okay with books containing those kinds of themes. Part of the way through, Sam buys a figurine at a comic book shop that he and Hayden used to frequent, and later that night, it starts talking to him. At the same time, he starts receiving messages on his computer from someone claiming to be Hayden, and the bullies around the town start getting forcibly put in their place. To the average reader, this seems like a tragic ghost story. And it stays that way for another 150 pages. Until, with like 20 pages left in the book, the author decides they've had enough of that, and pulls what was a side character to the forefront of the plot. Apparently, it was this side character beating up the bullies, and the messages were just Sam's imagination. Like, I'm fine if you want to not have a ghost story, but go back and edit the messages and talking statue out of the narrative. Don't just tell me that it was all trauma and shock causing him to hallucinate. Maybe that happens in real life, but in fictional worlds, it just doesn't. Just like Kind of a Big Deal, I can tell that this author probably did not plot the book before they started, and as I said, you're in for some weird storylines when that happens. The next one up here is We Were Liars. This book tried to have a plot twist, but it just ended up weird. It also tried to have unique writing, but that was just weird. It tried to get creative with description, but that turned out weird as well. This book was the epitome of weird, and honestly, I don't know what else to say in my intro. It follows Cadence, a very privileged white girl in a respected family full of rich people problems, and her group of friends, the Liars. The Liars go to their grandparents' private island and stay every summer until one summer something goes wrong, and Cadence wakes up in the hospital with only the memory of a headache and being naked and in pain on a rock. Not completely out there in the world of YA thrillers. First off, the writing is weird. It constantly has line breaks out of the blue, and it is incredibly choppy. I think the author was trying to represent how Cadence found it hard to think after the accident, but it made it hard for me to read. The author constantly describes how the character is feeling using extended metaphors for things like internal pain. For example, in one passage, as her father is leaving the house, he apparently pulls out a handgun and shoots her in the chest. The author describes blood everywhere, but it turns out that that was just how Cadence felt knowing that her father left her. Then you would have parts of the book where it seems like the author is doing this metaphor thing again, but it turns out that what is described actually happened. For example, when the Heathcliff reminiscent love interest of the story makes jabs at her for not realizing her privilege, quote, "My veins opened, my wrist split, I bled down my palms, I felt lightheaded," end quote. I thought this was one of the author's attempts at being poetic, but it turned out that she's actually cutting herself, and said love interest is bandaging her up afterwards. It's weird. Then the plot twist. 2 years after the accident, Cadence returns to the island and at the beginning has a summer that's as normal as it can get after what happens. She hangs out with her cousins, lounges by the beach, etc. But then it turns out that last year she burned her grandparents' house down and accidentally killed her cousins in the fire. The cousins she had been talking to, ghosts. And once they show her what actually happened, they leave. Weird. This next one is When We Were Magic. This book opens during a scene in which our main character, Alexis, regrets leading a boy on and blows his penis up right before they're going to have sex, killing him. It's weird. We learn during this scene that Alexis is a teen witch, and so are all of her friends. This magic is what bonds them, and they all support each other, blah blah blah. Anyway, Alexis calls her friends to help her dispose of the body, because obviously a group of magic people could not possibly bring someone back to life. They end up sort of failing at the disposing of the body part. They end up splitting it into separate organs, and they each take an organ to dispose of it separately. Weird. Then, a few chapters later, they realize that, hey, maybe they could try to bring him back to life. So they cast a spell in front of the heart, and it starts beating by itself. Weird. Then they decide they should try bringing all the body parts back together and seeing if that works, so they embark on this big adventure to recover the body parts they have disposed of, and it segues into this romance between Alexis and one of the people in their friend group. Oh, and because of their faulty spell, they end up losing parts of themselves. One loses the ability to cry, one loses the ability to see the color green, and Alexis loses the ability to dream. Weird. I'd say this was one of the weirdest books on this list just because of the combination of factors. It was weird. Anyway, that is all the books I have here. Those were some weird books, I must say. Yeah, thanks for watching. If you do want to subscribe, I'm trying to get to 50 subscribers before, let's say, August 15th. We'll go for the 15th again. I think we can do it. If just like one of you subscribes, we might get the momentum to bring us there. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.